Hello, son.
Part two of our conversation. The first was back in our first family home, first council house, and now we're on the estates in East London, Tower Hamlets, with Canary Wharf behind us, where you used to work.
hmm
Tell me about that. We're going to have a conversation, about your work with the community, with housing association. I think you started off in housing benefits first of all. Is
Yes,
that
I
right?
did. That was way back in 1990, 1991, I think. And I used to be a teacher, but I had to move into public sector, that side of public sector, because they offer flexible working. And to be able to raise my children, they were so small then. And so I had to move into public sector working. So I started with housing benefits, and majorly what you do is to award assistance to people on low income to be able to stay in their homes, and at times do checks on the income that they are providing to you.
Okay.
So I think after a while, I did that, and I started with Wandsworth Borough. That was in southwest, south of the river. I moved into Tower Hamlets. Those were the days when the Canary Wharf was just developing. It was a marshland, and it has all the memories of what it used to be as a dockland where they used to do the trades. I did that for about, I think, 6 years. Then I moved into housing management, and that was when I came on to Popular Haka.
One of the biggest housing associations is social housing associations, what would you call it in East London? Yeah.
Oh, in East London,
Yeah.
not in England, in East London. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So they sort of contained, and they manage the properties in East London, I would say. Yeah.
Cool. Quite a lot of stuff to unpack there. One of the first things, talking about your work in public sector. So, I think you worked in public sector all of your working life. What was it, apart from the flexible working, that kept you there?
I enjoy working with the community, with the various people, especially when I moved into housing management. That involves developing community, it involves working with people, and that is my passion. Seeing that people are included in things that they need to do, making them live comfortably in the community, and take ownership of that place, the pride in their community. It's a long, I would say it's not something you do in one day. It's a process, and I think looking back from when I started here to what it is now, it's got a big change, and people are sort of proud to live in their community.
And talking about the change, so you saw Canary Wharf when it was a marshland, you said.
Oh yes, and I think at that time the building that is standing for most people will be like your Billingsgate market where you buy your fish. But those were the early days when they started doing when the banks started moving there and started making the buildings. And now it's the financial district of England, if I would say. Yes, you used to see all the marshes then, and you used to see all the water and everything. And the transport wasn't that brilliant or fab at that time. It was remote, but now it's changed.
And how did the community that you were working with at the time feel about that change? And how did you feel about that change?
I think people are always worrisome about changes, because when the changes were evolving, new houses are coming up. People are apprehensive about, what is this going to mean for them? People are used to living in their own homes, and now there's a big change, especially on the Isle of Dogs. You then have all these multiple buildings coming on, they're reclaiming the marshes, and some people like the change, some people think it's too much, but a lot has happened.
Yeah, even as we were coming here, you were talking about some of the roads in Langdon Park here in Tower Hamlets that's changed from what you used to manage?
Yes, those days you used to have a lot of greens, open fields and parks. But then there's need to get many more people into houses or into their homes. So some of those lands are reclaimed, and you have to get homes for people.
Yeah, and let's talk about getting those homes for people. So what was your actual job? What were you doing?
Right, when I was here, used to be more of compliance, making sure that people that are made to stay in the homes are the actual people they are not subletting, making sure that the estate is kept clean, making sure that people are inclusive in things that are happening on the estate, making a place people desire to live, that they want to be. Because you've come from this era where things are sort of like they're sort of like one of the poorest community in the country, and lifting that profile. Because if you see, like you said, the backdrop here is the Canary Wharf, and you don't want it to look as if Canary Wharf is a proud neighbor to here. So you sort of,
You don't want like people left behind almost.
yeah, left behind. I think that's the right word. Getting people to, moving them along as well, and getting some of the shops to come around and making life.
And when you say shops coming around, like do you mean local businesses also come in here as well? How did you
Local
like want to attract
businesses
them?
and the likes of your Pret or Costa Coffee. And that way you get some of these bankers or high-flying jobs coming to stay here, and you sort of get that mix in the community. Because like I said before, Poplar was sort of tagged as the poorest borough or poorest area in England at that time. So it's a lot of work to sort of get mixture of people, to get people that works in Canary Wharf to find it desirable to come and stay, and to get other people.
Because some of those people working in Canary Wharf were living in other parts of London or the country and coming in and then going out, and
Yeah.
the money wasn't kind of circulating in the area.
No, it wasn't coming here. So
Okay.
it's about getting the money to come here as well, and
Yeah.
be part of it.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned about is part of your job was the compliance stuff, which, if I'm understanding what you were saying, that might have been a bit challenging, because on one hand, you're asking people to, or you're checking people to comply with regulation and law, and on the other hand, you want them to engage in kind of policy making process. Have I understood that right, first of all?
I think that is part of it as well. Because one of the things is, if people that are meant to stay in the property are not the people staying, if they offend, it'll be difficult to
Penalise them, collect money, or...
It's not about penalizing as well. It will be difficult to pin them down and make it desirable for everyone to stay. So if I give you an example, in the early days, you find graffiti all over the places. So if it's your Joe Blocks that no one knows in the community, it'll be difficult to pin them down, and it'll be difficult to sort of maybe engage them and do some corrections. So all that kind of things. And if you get people that are not supposed to live there, don't forget it's subsidized housing.
Okay.
It's not the full market rent.
Yeah.
So it's about public money, and it's about ensuring that the public money goes in the right place.
Yeah.
So
Value for
if
taxpayers and all that.
Yeah, so if people that are not meant to stay there are staying, that is not justice for public money.
Okay. Wow. Two things I want to go on to. One, on the taxpayers' money and kind of ensuring value for money there. But just going back to that compliance stuff a little bit more, was it difficult trying to be both the, I don't know, like...
You are those two hats.
Yeah, the enforcer, but then also the community builder.
It can be difficult, and you have to be subtle in the way you do it. So yes, you sort of having the stick, you're having the carrots. But I think for majority of the people, they are complying, and you just get the little that maybe are not complying, and you don't want them to spoil the good works that you did, and I think that is why
Do you remember any particular challenging conversations or cases with compliance that you had to deal with?
Oh, I can't mention that now.
No, you can. Remember, the statute of limitations, whatever you want to call it, is gone. You don't have to use names, but just an example of a challenging conversation.
I think most of the time it would be like when you have people that are not meant to be living in the property that are living there. If they then go on.
Could you also like spot them from a mile away? Or did you have to do like investigations?
And after working in partnership with some organizations in the community, you sort of know some of those things. For example, dealing in drugs. It's a big one at one time. Not big one, but it's something you need to be mindful about. And I think I was involved in one where the actual tenants are not living in the property, and there was a damage to the property below. And by the time we had to force entry to go in, it was a big factory going on.
Cannabis factory?
Yes.
Okay.
And we had to get the police involved and all the enforcement.
They have heat detectors these days for that?
Yeah, these days. Things have come on along now, so you can easily detect.
And couldn't you just take the smell? No? Or you don't want cannabis? Obviously, my mum doesn't know what cannabis smells like.
I'm not, and I think they mask it well, because they have, what do you call it, like a deodorizer attached to the walls that is going intermittently. So they work professionally, if I could say. Don't forget, even when you have your technology, because they want the money, they're always one step ahead to sort of do what they want to do.
Yeah.
So it's about making sure, because you don't want anyone doing that on your estate, because it ruins people's life.
So yeah, like talking about the poverty and crime a little bit, were there some situations that you found quite dangerous and challenging, or was it quite a safe thing most of the time for you personally?
I think this estate at that time was safe for me. There was some estate, I don't want to mention names, where you are given incentive to come and work there.
Oh wow, because it was so challenging to attract people to those East London estates.
Yeah, I got a job in one East London, I will mention the city now. And at that time, they call it factor. They mention the name of the city, and they say they give additional incentive to work on this estate because it's so challenging. You've got so many antisocial behaviors and so many things to contend with, and people sort of shy away.
Yeah, understood. Moving the conversation on a little bit, going back to that value for taxpayer stuff that you were kind of mentioning. So the facts that subsidised housing. Actually, another bit to just mention is, did you have any challenges, or was there any tensions with private landlords? Because subsidised housing, and other landlords that wanted maybe higher market rents, all of that stuff, was that a challenge?
Not then really, because we concentrated more on the social housing and providing for people that need homes. And I think the mix is now changed. About 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you have lot of everyone wants to go onto the social housing. But it's changed now. You've got different kind of tenures. And I think one of the things they did was the estate not to be stereotyped to say, 100% social housing. So they tried to bring in mixture of different kind of tenures. So those were the days when you have shared ownership. So you could own a part of the property right away, and your landlord own a share as well, and it gets you onto the property ladder. And you've got some properties on the estate that are private landlord outright. So because it's mixed tenure, it sort of generates mixture of property, people as well.
Yeah.
So it's not just people that wanted social housing that are on the estate. So that sort of improved the community as well.
Yeah. I don't know if you're aware, in Berlin, city in Germany, they, I'm pretty sure it's Berlin, they have market cap or rent cap. So there is a cap set by the council or government or something that says, yeah, rent cannot be above this value. And I think in New York they also have something like that for people that have owned property for a long time. Any idea if that kind of policy, that kind of idea would work in a place like this? Or
It is. You have that here, and what they try to do is, so for example, if I'm on social benefit, I cannot just go and rent a property that is above a certain amount. So it is capped. If you have your money flowing from back of your pocket, you can choose to live in.
yeah, but no, I think the cap is for
everyone.
Yeah, for everyone, and
Okay.
you know, yeah, rent in this area cannot be above this price.
They do that here. They call it market rent.
Okay.
I think most importantly is for. It won't be for like your private renting. So for example, because it will be difficult to do that. So you have someone in Canary Wharf that choose to pay 5 figures rent per month. They wanted that luxury, and that is what you now have. They have that. But if you're going to rent, then you cannot say, I haven't got any money, I want government to pay 5 figures.
Government will only be able to go a certain level.
Yes,
yeah.
that is what we
And then
have
naturally,
here.
I suppose the market would follow, and because yeah, particularly those landlords that would want to, you know, rent to tenants that are on subsidised housing.
Yeah.
Then yeah, okay. Probably pick that up in another conversation later. Probably closing now a little bit. So how many years altogether were you in housing here in East London? You're obviously looking very young and fresh, so.
Right, like I said, you have various types of housing. So I was in housing benefit initially.
Yeah.
So moving to housing management, I think that started around year 2000, and I left that about 10 years ago. So that would be, if you do the maths, that would be about 13 years.
Yeah, long time. Okay. Fondest memories, like your most happiest memories of your time here on the estates in East London. What are your fondest memories?
I love the community. I love working with the people. And at times, I think the joy is when you're starting something from the scratch. Like at times, like when people do not own the community before, and you sort of see them detached from it, and now they sort of take pride in the community they live in. That's a joy.
Amazing. Well done.
And they want to belong to the community as well.
Yeah.
And people don't shy, because before people sort of want to live in certain area, and they think, oh, some areas they don't want to go there. But changing that around and making people to belong is satisfying.
Yeah, and it's laid the foundation for even more development that's happening across East London.
It's changed a lot around here, and I think a couple of times when I've come back to this area, I've seen more buildings, and it sort of changed the mix.
Yeah. Should we go around and look at some of the estates you used to work on?
Yes, it's spread around because I moved across different estates.
How many estates altogether across East London would you say you managed?
Not just East London, this is popular part of East London. East London is big.
Yeah.
So I used to manage Lansbury, where we're speaking now.
Yeah.
East Indian Dock. I used to manage Devon's, Bridge Estate, Coventry Cross, Teviot, and all those areas. They sort of like remote before. But even with the Dockland Railway coming, it sort of opened it up as well, and developers coming in to build, and community engagement is sort of open places up for people.
Cool. And the future of like housing and development, what do you think some of the challenges might be as you try to, build more, you try and get housing for?
I'm not current in housing now, so I won't be able to make that comment.
No worries. Okay, so should we go around and have a look at some of the estates?
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Alright. Clap, test. Okay. Hello, Mum.
Hello, son.
Back on another part of the estate. So yeah, tell me about this place and what you used to remember of the place, etc.
This is Cheviot Estate, part of the estate I used to manage. Used to sort of be part of a remote area and not open up, but a lot has changed. Like the school, it's got new additions to it. You've got new modern buildings added to it. Like just behind us, you've got the new station, Random Park, and that is connected the communities to other areas. It's opened it up. You've got those new buildings. I remember I used to had to sort of get some of them let on social housing, because what you have now is mixed tenure, where you have a percentage bought outright, a percentage on shared ownership, and a percentage given to people that can afford to buy. And it used to be challenging to manage, but I have memories of going into these buildings right behind me to get the tenants to settle in there and sort of manage those different groups that I've talked about.
And yeah, so talk about that a little bit more about managing the different groups, particularly when there's change happening, new people coming in, a mixture of people. Yeah, your memories of keeping a community together, or trying to at least.
It's a bit of a challenge, because when you have someone buying their property outright, that means, if you like, I don't like talking about classes, but they sort of like maybe working class and they've got a bit of money. And when you get someone, most of the time on social housing, they're low income and they're struggling to rent out from the market. And when you put all that in a pot and contain them in the same building, they've got different aspirations, they've got different input into it. Someone is put their money to buy, someone might not know the cost because they're getting it on social housing. And it's about making everyone to live together and appreciate that and have their input into the community. Everyone has something that they can bring in, cultural wise, social, economic wise, and that is part of what makes the community.
Amazing. And you spoke about the station as well, and in particular, like I think you actually said you had to turn down one job because you couldn't reach there because the transport wasn't there.
Yeah, it's not the station. I think that was actually in Canary Wharf, that is right behind us. Those days you have lots of marshland and the banks have not come into the area. Development have not started at all. So those days you haven't got good transport connection. So I think I got this job, and the buses, I think they get there by after 9:30, no more bus. And the next run of buses will come, I think like in the evening. The tram is not working and it's so remote. And I thought, God help me, I can't take this kind of job. I'll be struggling to get to work. So I had to turn the job, but it's now very connected. You've got DLR, you've got different buses going in, and it's opened up that way, and it's brought lots of people in now.
Cool.
Different from what you have 30-something odd years ago. Very different.
So you used to manage an estate or houses around here.
Yeah.
Some of the other places we're looking at, and some places that we may not be able to reach today. Just any other reflections or memories of those places?
Yeah, there's one building we're looking across now. It looks so beautiful now. Before, that building used to be like a rundown. Nobody wants to take it. People don't feel secured. And it has to be commissioned to come down and rebuild it all over again. And it's amazing how they've changed it around from a rundown block of flats to a desirable block of flats that people want to live. And I remember when it wasn't desirable, you want to let it, you'll have to be saying your little prayers about how someone is going to take this home from me. But now, it looks really nice. It's a place people want to be, and it's sort of a proud spot on the community as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing those memories
yes, lovely memories. And I think with the influx of different part of the community, I'm not sure what it is now, but before I left, the antisocial behavior reduces as well.
As people have more collective ownership of a place,
Yes,
etc.
they do, yeah. So it sort of helps.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you. Ooh, that has been done. Let me finish this one.
Morning, Sam.
Hi.
Thank you for welcoming me to City Hall, Assembly Member for North East. How are you this morning?
I'm good.
Good. It's a lovely venue here, and we're going to talk about housing and your experiences as an Assembly Member and a Londoner.
Yeah.
So thanks again for welcoming me to City Hall. Perhaps starting off by your experiences in London. Where have you lived? Where have you been around?
Okay.
What's your experiences?
Yeah, well, it's really nice to have you, and I'm glad you like the building. It's, like you say, nice and bright and airy. So I grew up in North London, in Finchley, and I moved around 2002 to Hackney. And I have lived in lots of different places in Hackney. I've lived in Victoria Park, I've lived in Stamford Hill, I've moved back to Victoria Park, moved again, which is basically the journey of a lot of people in London. So I was renting with friends and then kind of have moved around as either the rent's gone up or I've kind of moved on to a different life stage. Brief spell in Islington, and then I moved back to where I am right now in South Hackney in Haggerston, and I've been living there with my partner for about 6 years.
So something sort of kept you in Hackney or that part of London for a while. Are they distinct, tangible things, or it's felt like home for a long time?
Yeah, it feels, so my mum and my sisters joke that they just feel like I'm from Hackney now. And every single time I had to make that move, I know people move for financial reasons, I was really keen to stay there because I'd built my life there, had friends there, relationships there, and got involved in the council at a point. So staying on to be able to continue to be a local councillor was really important to me, and just a sense of wanting to stay in a place that I could give back to the community in an elected role or in any other way.
Cool. And we're going to get into kind of your specialism of housing policy, etc. But before that, do you mind if I just tease in a little bit more about what drove you to stand in as a councillor? I mean, it feels like there's a thick vein of public service in your career so far. Yeah.
So I guess I got involved in the Labour Party around 2004-05, and so the first time I was out canvassing was for my local MP, Meg Hillier. She's the MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch. And, I did all the stuff that people normally do. I was out kind of not quite understanding what's happening, learning from people who've been doing it. Yeah, exactly. Delivering leaflets, talking to people. And actually at the time I was working in international development. So I didn't particularly have a focus on what was happening, if you like, here. And I think through that contact with speaking to my literal neighbours in the area that I lived, it was kind of, actually, this is a really good way to continue, to start some of that kind of working for the community, but not just kind of some communities overseas, but actually the problems that you look at around poverty, housing, all those things. At the moment we're talking about damp and mould, so sanitation. Those are issues that affect people here, and I can make more of a difference here. And I guess there were lots of things along the way that led me to it, but I've always had, from my parents, a strong sense of wanting to give back to the community, but around public service and engagement and reform. So both my parents moved here in the 70s from South Africa, and that was always a really big part of who they were. Just the fact that they have built their lives here, and they've got 3 very British children, but there was always a sense for them that home was elsewhere. And just the fact that it's always been ingrained in me, I think is subconscious, that a home is what grounds you, and from that point you can build your life. So in the case of my parents, their homes were taken away during the apartheid regime, and they were moved to other parts of Pretoria. That's where they're from.
Wow.
And but that happened to every single black person at that time, and so it was never kind of front and centre, but it was always expressed in different ways. So we'd have people passing through from South Africa, going to other places, maybe in Europe, to claim asylum there, or going to Canada was a really popular place for aunties and uncles to stop over and then kind of catch flights to Canada to go and start living there. And I think all of that has just kind of osmotically shaped me, over a period of time. And it's kind of informed the career choices I've made in either the not-for-profit sector or when I was working in the private sector, working around resident engagement and regeneration and housing as well. So here I am at City Hall. Amazing,
wow. Yeah. I don't know where to jump off from that, but perhaps one of the first things you mentioned on your experiences in international development. There is always a tension, I think, with the British electorate about showing the benefits and the value of doing, development overseas and work overseas, and why doing that over there benefits our security, peace, whatever you want to call it here. Is that something you still see as an Assembly member, or you think the argument kind of keeps needing to be made, or people have moved on slightly? Or
I think, so where London government sits in the way that we live our lives, people, I think they understand local government because they deliver services, and they understand national government because they legislate and determine what we can and cannot do to some extent. But I think the role of London government is really unique in the sense that it is a link between that national bit, but also works most closely with boroughs and with where people live and work and live their daily lives. So I was just yesterday in Islington, for example, with some Islington councillors and residents, and they were holding a vigil for the people who sadly lost their lives in Turkey and Syria. And I guess the connection with that is, that is something that's happened far, far away, but there are thousands of people in London. There are 500,000 Turkish, Kurdish and Syrian people that live in London. Most of them live, a lot of them are in my constituency. Some are a little bit further north in Joanne McCartney's constituency in Haringey. But that is very much something that happens far away, definitely determines kind of your relationships here and what we can do. So there are practical things that we can talk about in terms of supporting people that are nominally far away, but they have a direct consequence on the lives of people here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a present example. Perhaps just one more thing now before going to housing. Yeah. So the experiences from South Africa that have shaped your parents and have shaped you, is that something you feel strongly today, or something that's kind of you hope to address in the future, or?
And how do you mean?
In the sense of those experiences, I'm sure they shaped your politics, and maybe it's the injustice you experience. Is that something you feel you kind of want to champion or address in the work that you do? Or?
Yeah, well, so yes, but not in a way that I guess is obvious. So I think my parents worked really, really hard for me and my sisters to be protected from a lot of the stuff that they went through. So they chose Finchley as a black couple, which is a bit odd. But at the time it was a place where those political asylum seekers and refugees, there was no small group of people that were living in that part of London, and so it felt like a natural place to be. But each and every one of those people, they made a massive step to make sure that they raised children that were not discriminatory, that they sent us to school, were really, all of those sorts of things that we take for granted in this country, which are really, really difficult in the context that they grew up in. And things have changed massively in South Africa, but there are still lots of difficulties, and that inequality is, I would say, it's more financially based rather than class based as it is here. And so very, very aware of that. But as things have progressed in South Africa, the parallels between here and there are easier to draw, I would say. There is some level of normality. I had a friend actually who she is Indian and her girlfriend is South African, and a friend from here went to visit them in Johannesburg, and he was like, oh my God, it's like Wakanda. And he was like, but it's not, it's just like being here, but the other way around, like everyone's just black, but life is just as it is here. And I think, so stuff like that is a bit of a surprise, but I think people have the same struggles here as they do there. And then there are additional things to do with the governance of that country, which we don't face. But I would say, if I was being a little bit polemical, I think our corruption is institutionalised.
And not as obvious.
It's not obvious,
yeah.
but money still trades hands, and all favours are done for people. So I think I am not in favour. Obviously, I'm not in favour of kind of that approach to things. I want to continue to kind of live my politics as far as I can, and be very much about merit and supporting people to do as well as they can, which is what I think my parents instilled in me.
Yeah, very interesting what you say about the favours trading hands, etc. type thing, and it's something I say to my parents and aunties and uncles a lot, particularly in the Nigerian context, since the Nigerian election. But I don't want any of us to get into trouble, so I'm perhaps going to move on.
Yeah,
slightly.
No worries.
Housing.
Yeah.
So as I've described, my mum worked for one of the biggest housing associations in East London for a lot of her working life. And yeah, this is a really interesting conversation for me because I used to work here in City Hall, or the old City Hall in Tower Bridge. So housing in London, in East London, the challenges, the opportunities. I'll approach this a little bit from a layperson's point of view. So first of all, the challenges. If you could explain from your point of view what they are and what the tools are in the Assembly's arsenal to kind of fix some of those things.
Okay, so on the tour we just briefly saw some of the deputy mayors upstairs, and so City Hall's role I think is potentially massive. So determining and deciding so we have something called the London Plan, and to summarise, it is a document which says what gets built, how it gets built, who it's for and when. But it's a 30-year strategic plan, spatial strategy. But basically,
from when to when? From like 20...
It was, so one of our many housing ministers, Robert Jenrick, held it up for political reasons before the elections here. And so it was approved in, I want to say 2021 or 22.
Okay.
And it's updated periodically. So that just kind of gives anyone who wants to build anything, and it's not just houses, it's also like hospitals, it's data centres, which are a really huge thing.
Stadiums as well? Stadia?
So things for public use.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay.
I don't think it's quite so prescriptive, because then you've got local boroughs that will decide what within their footprint they need and how much of it they need.
Sure.
And then you've got there are two mayoral development corporations which are quite important strategically. We've got here in East London the LLDC, London Legacy Development Corporation, which was put together for the Olympics and to kind of across borough work to get the stadia built and to do a lot of the remodelling and kind of remediate the land, which was contaminated after years of being lots of industrial work there. And so that's where you would get, like, we're going to stick a stadium here because that's where we need it, and then this is what it will be used for afterwards, in the case of the London Stadium, but also like the Copper Box and so on. And then there are homes in the Olympic Park. And then there's another one in West London called the OPDC, which is similar, but is very much more focused on housing and workspace. So that's kind of like the high level stuff that City Hall does. And sorry, just on that, so that's the LLDC physically, or holding capital for projects, or is it more the planning permission? So mainly the planning permissions.
Okay.
There are lots of partners within LLDC. So basically, it was a planning authority, and in fact, one of the things that the boroughs have been pushing for is to have their planning powers given back. So they're going to be going back to the boroughs. So Hackney, Newham, Tower Hamlets, Waltham Forest was in the body, but doesn't actually have any land.
Just forests.
Yeah, and I can't remember the fifth one, but don't shoot me. It'll come back to me as soon as we're done filming. But so all of those local authorities, they will get their planning powers back, so they'll be able to decide again what gets built on their bit of the Olympic Park, if anything, or how it's managed, all that sort of stuff. So in practice, we'll see how that changes. And that's a good example of devolving that back, I think.
Yeah. Are you in favour of that approach?
Yeah, I think it's right that local people get to decide what gets built, or local authorities get to decide what gets built in their neighbourhoods, because they understand their communities best. But I do think there is a time and a place for development corporations, because nobody was living there. Well, there were a couple of traveller sites in the area, but it wasn't a residential neighbourhood. So to start from a blank sheet of paper, you need somebody who doesn't have the concerns necessarily of the local authority, like service delivery, to start from zero and get it to a point and then hand it back.
And convene everyone
Exactly.
around a
Yeah. It's like, what do you want? What do you want? What do you want? So Hackney was really interested in workspace, and Here East, which is a big complex with 2 universities, UCL and Loughborough, and some other workspace in there. It's on the Hackney side. And then Newham was keen on lots of housing, so a large amount of the housing is on the Newhams. All those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So when it goes back, people have got what they wanted.
Yeah.
So there's that, but I think the strength potentially of the Assembly is what we do here as Assembly members in holding the Mayor to account. And so as everybody knows, people run on manifestos and make various commitments. And as somebody who's really passionate about housing, the housing manifesto commitments, for the reasons that I stated about it's the bedrock of everything, are really, really important to determining how people get to live their lives here in London. And so I think the issues for the last few years, definitely the last 15 years, possibly more. Somebody who I rate very highly, Stella Creasy, she's an MP in my patch. I've known her for a number of years. She would always say there is always too much month at the end of someone's pay packet. And the summary of, I think, the housing crisis is that's one element. Housing is far too expensive. So the increases in local housing allowance have not kept pace with private sector housing rents. And that has an impact on people in social housing as well as in private housing. But it means if you're in receipt of benefits, which so I think about 40% of working people in London are in receipt of some kind of support. So that's a lot of people who are struggling to pay their rent, to pay their bills, energy costs are through the roof right now. And all I would say is that people were rightly really upset by the increases in interest rates and the impact that has had on mortgage holders, whether they're owner-occupiers or landlords, because that is an existential threat to those people, the people that live in those homes. People were rightly upset about the energy prices going up as they did, because that is also an existential threat to people. But for me, the source of many problems that we have is the fact that existential threat to the millions of Londoners who live in the private rented sector, who 20 years ago would have lived in social housing, places like where your mum worked. Places like that don't have the housing anymore because it's been right to buy, or because now land values are now really high in this part of London, and people can no longer afford to buy land, to develop land. And that means that when you go to build something, you need to get that money back. So therefore, somebody moving into your property can't afford to live there. And it's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken somehow. And I guess to answer your original question, when I moved to Hackney, it was one of the reasons I moved because I had friends that lived in East London, in Whitechapel, and I was moving out of home. And we got a house together, and it was a place that we could afford to live, because East London was historically a place that was relatively affordable. And with hindsight now, there were 5 of us living in a family home. So perhaps a family could have lived there. But the rent was eminently affordable at the time to us. And just as an example, I was earning, my first job was £15,000 a year, and I could afford my room, my house share. I don't know if anybody could afford a house share now on that kind of...
It feels very unlikely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so the point is that people's wages here in this part of London, people tend to have low to middle income jobs, and their wages have not kept up with the cost of housing here, and so they are really, really struggling. And then I think there is a tension between people that move into the area, arguably people like me back in the day, but others as well, who move to this area because there is a vibrancy, there is life. People like the fact that you can, express yourself as you want, and but there's still a sense of community. That I think is something which a Labour mayor and Labour councils grapple with every day to try and make sure that cohesiveness remains.
Yeah.
That diversity, it's a genuine diversity, but that everybody that wants to live here can. And so in terms of what I think is really important, obviously we need to build more houses. We need to build more, particularly more social housing, but I would say that we need to build more of everything. And we need, in addition to that regulation of the private rented sector, the stuff that people live in now is so awful, it's unbelievable. I was recently, so I'm also councillor in Hackney, and I have a portfolio around the private rented sector, and I recently went to visit a woman and her daughter in their one-bedroom flat, and this is kind of in the light of the damp and mould issues that have come to light, particularly since the death of Awab Ishaq. But this is a private sector home, and she has been struggling for a number of months to just get really, really basic things done. Years, sorry, rather than months. And we shouldn't be in a situation where that happens. There should be a recourse to remediate some of those problems. Now, I know that the social housing sector also has problems, and in terms of actioning some of that, and that is not excusable. The thing I would say is that housing needs to be treated, if it's treated like an asset, then it needs to be invested in. It is not possible to have social housing run on a shoestring, as local authorities and housing associations have been forced to do. I exclude the bigger ones from that, but small associations have been forced to do for the last 13 years and expect a gold star service. That just doesn't happen. So I think the actual costs of fixing people's homes, retrofitting them so that they're energy efficient, and dealing with damp and mould, and building more homes so that those people that are overcrowded can move, that has to be a priority for a future Labour government, and that continues to be a priority here at City Hall for the Labour Mayor and the Labour group.
Yeah. A lot to unpack there. I might start off with thinking about the regulation of the private market.
Yeah.
So, as I understand it, as you've said, damp issues, maybe some properties need capital investment to upgrade them, modernise them, etc. Where does the power lie in instigating that, and who are the blockers, apart from the obvious landlords, in getting a way forward, in your opinion?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that there is a bill going through, Awab's law, about damp and mould, and the current Secretary of State, I say current, he might change, Michael Gove, has put in place some, actually good measures around responsibilities around remediating damp and mould in the social housing sector.
Yeah.
Now, it would not be beyond the wit of man to extend that to the private rented sector as well. That would be a logical thing to do. And so that power to decide what needs to be done is within the gift of the government. And so there is a partly ideological blocker around, in this particular case, extending that very logical thing to the private rented sector.
So almost a purely political choice to
it's
say
a political
whether
choice
to
exactly
have private renters in that conversation
or
not. And just double checking as well, is there also a financial one that, when you regulate something, you then have to monitor and police it, which has additional costs on council, or in your mind it's purely ideological or political choice? So
councils do, there are some basic standards that they have to meet. Get geeky, the HHSRS, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. There are some baseline standards that all housing has to meet, and they do that in the private rented sector. So you get environmental health officers will go out on a daily basis and inspect and then tell landlords you need to fix this, this, and this.
Sorry, and just to get into some detail, inspect randomly or inspect upon invitation?
So it's a combination of both.
Okay.
In places where they, so in cases where, like the one that I told you, if something is reported, either directly or through a third party, then they would inspect, and that would be on invitation. But they might have, in places where they have licensing regimes, there would be a more, I guess, proactive approach. So go out to places and just inspect everything in order to issue the license. And that's the way that you sometimes pick up that there are issues in a property.
Yeah.
Most landlords, to be fair to them, are like, oh, I didn't know. And they generally fix it. The issue becomes what happens then to the tenant. So it's a multi-layered thing. If your landlord fixes a property and thinks, oh, I could get more money for this, boots you out because you're on an assured short-term tenancy, you have no recourse to saying, I'm not moving. Whereas a social tenant does. You need to have a reason to throw somebody out. At the moment, that isn't in place. And so...
Is that in places like New York, or is that slightly separate? Is that on... Or are you familiar with some of the renter protections in New York?
Yeah, so the protections there are slightly different. I guess where it's... but I think there are... People also quote like the model in place in Berlin, for example.
Yeah.
And
which is also a cap, right? Is that right?
Yeah. And in some big cities in France as well, there is a citywide cap on what the maximum rent increase could be for the whole city. That's one method, but within each of those, they are responding to a local context. So one of the things that Sadiq had in the manifesto, which I continue to push for along with colleagues, is for the government to devolve some of that power to London, to the mayor under the GLA Act, to put in place a London-specific commission to look at the London context and to then develop a London-specific rent control. And so this is just me spitballing. I would imagine that would be a mixture of landlords, large and small. That would be lenders, so banks. So things like when you get your buy-to-let mortgage from somebody, from a lender, there are certain terms in there, like you may not take somebody who is on social security, the length of the tenancy, all of those sorts of things. There are things which can be overcome, and obviously politicians, local and national, in that conversation, and the tenant's voice as well. And why I think it's important that it's London specific is that we do have a different housing market here to the rest of the country. And within that wider market, there are different ways that it operates. So it operates very differently here in East London as it does to some parts of central and inner London. So very, very wealthy places like Kensington, Westminster. Those are examples of what happens when your housing policy really kind of runs its course, and the places have been completely hollowed out. And I think they're really instrumental. So you either have to be very, very poor to live there now, very, very wealthy to live there now, or you have to have been born before a certain point in time in order to have made a rational choice for yourself and exercised your right to buy. But the problem with the right to buy policy is that what is a rational choice for an individual becomes completely irrational at a macro zoomed out level because somebody has made the right decision for their household. But if everybody does that, you end up with no houses in the system, which is where we are right now. So that replacement becomes even more important, and replacement at pace. When we met the other day, I did say rather polemically that I don't think people should be able to object to social housing when it comes to planning. And I think if we are serious as a labour movement, we need to really think about how we are the champions of social housing, but not just theoretically, but actually in it being built. So are there processes in the planning system that mean that there should be greater regard to a development if it has a certain amount of social housing? In the London plan, that number is 35%. So there are two different, I can't remember what it's called, but one is faster and one is like more thorough if it's below 35%. And boroughs by and large follow that. So I know that Islington, they've managed to achieve like 45-50% for their faster application process. But the point is, if we want to actually get those homes built, we need to think about making that easier for housing associations and incentivizing private developers who build out Section 106. And that incentive is not money. That incentive is that if you build another 15 units of social housing, the rest of your application, subject to meeting these baseline criteria, will go through as a whole, but not kind of hiving stuff off. The moment you hive it off, you say it's not viable. Like, well, then how is the rest of it viable? You know. I would also say, and this is very difficult territory in light of Grenfell, but I do think that there is a case to be made for greater density of homes. London is, particularly the part that I represent, it goes from Islington, which is extremely compact, Hackney, which is kind of half in between, right through to Waltham Forest, which is obviously Chingford, the social housing there. There's a mixture, more houses than flats in comparison to the inner bits of my constituency. But the principle still remains that if you are building those homes, people should be able to understand how it benefits them individually. So again, appealing to that individual rational choice, and also how it then benefits the community as a whole.
It feels like there's an undertone with a lot of what you're saying about, and if it's a wrong mischaracterization, please tell me, almost interventional societal engineering to say, yeah, at the local, hyper-local level, family units,
Yep.
they make rational choices which has a tension with what a city might need to be vibrant and to have that kind of mix of housing, as you say.
Yeah.
Do you think that's quite a strong interventionist thing for an authority to do, or you think, given the state of housing stock, etc., that's kind of what's needed?
So I think we start from the point that the housing market in London is broken. It's not just a little bit broken, it is bust open wide, right? If you're going to fix something which is so comprehensively dysfunctional, you do need to have some very brave interventions. And I think tinkering at the margins doesn't fix the problem. So if you are on a waiting list, the housing waiting lists in East London vary from 8,000-9,000 right up to 27, 28 at the extreme. If you're one of those people sat on a housing waiting list, you do need housing. You probably will be told, the way things are with the current system we have, it's a 10 to 15 year wait for a council house. Which
is what my mates did, they knew from 13 years old early to put it in and not expect it till they're 30.
So, and as a councillor, I still get that casework and people saying I need to be rehoused, and I know what the wait is. The waiting is, it's 11 years, so you can sit on the waiting list, or you can, you need to raise your family, you need to live your life, so it's probably best that you try and find slightly more secure accommodation in the private rented sector. And that's across the piece, it's not just London, but it's much, much more acute in London. And then there are things like, which is where I possibly, my original point about we need to build a lot more of everything. I actually think that there is a role to play for homes to be built that are not just for rent, but homes for sale, homes for shared ownership, intermediate housing, so that people, as they kind of, go through different life stages, they can do that. So if you are the child of somebody in social housing, and you get a good job and you want to buy a home, your job doesn't allow you in the open market to buy a house there, but a shared ownership type home is something which would allow you to remain in your community, build your life close to your family and your friends, and not have to leave the city.
And if I got what you're saying right, does the devolution of planning permissions to local councils perhaps remove some of that strategic intent and planning? Because then, Council A might do its own mixture, which may not, align or complement what the council next door does, because they're kind of doing their own thing, responding to the local community needs. Is that accurate to some degree? Or?
I think to an extent, but I think it's right that local authorities respond to their immediate local context. I think that looking at it would be really difficult to do that at a pan-London level. Beyond, so if you look at the bit of the London plan which is about housing target numbers, policy H10, I have read that document a
Yeah,
bit.
very geeky on the
Sorry.
housing. Love it. I love
Yeah.
it.
So that policy is just really, it outlines in broad terms what are the housing targets for each borough. And then obviously there is a reporting mechanism to see how many starts there are, how many completions there are. And so in the last few years, we've built more social housing than we have in the last 30. And that is shocking because that is really, really good, but we need a lot more.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
And so the fact that there is that flexibility within that system is really important. I think the difference now is that because housing associations in that intervening 40-year period have taken on the role of developer, contractor, manager, there is a third party and their responsibilities are not necessarily to the local authority. It's to their own board members and to manage their own stock and their own assets. So there is an additional tension. I don't believe it can't be overcome, but I do think that there is a grown-up conversation to be had about what housing associations do and don't do. And if they're meeting a local need, then wonderful. But if they're not, then how can that be resolved to make sure that it is?
Yeah. There's an interesting dynamic here as well, which is absolutely a lot of housing issues in London are unique to London. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're talking about the Secretary of State Gove and that housing thing. I think he was as the portfolio of levelling up.
Yep.
How do you think London defends, or maybe it doesn't need to defend, it just needs to be bold, but defend some of its ambitions with housing with what other parts of the country are kind of maybe struggling with or don't have the same opportunities or mix?
I think the key factor that you have in London is the divergence between rents rather, and wages. The problem that we have is wage suppression, and that's most acute in London. If you are, so let's just say, for example, if you were to take the average London salary, let's say it's 30,000, it's not, but that's easier maths for me. So you've got one person on £30,000 and then one person working part-time, £15,000. Household income of 45,000, which is fairly standard if you're in a couple, perhaps with one or two children. That's not unusual. That is a good, that should be a good wage. At the moment, it is not a good wage in London. It's really difficult to survive on. If you're outside of London, you could live quite comfortably on that. You could probably even own a house with that, you know? And so there is a particular problem around affordability, hence the London-specific control that I think we need to look at. But then there are issues which affect London but other parts of the country, but in different ways. So think of like rural communities, for example, or seaside communities. My partner is from a seaside community in the south coast. There is nobody under the age of 60 in that town except at Christmas and when people come home for their parents' birthdays. And it is the most bewildering thing in the world, but it means that the people that are there, they at one point bought homes, raised families, and the lack of jobs mean that all of those people, that the adult children of those people, live in London in order to access the jobs here. So I think there is definitely something about rebuilding communities beyond London, and having viable economies outside of London so that people that are currently in those places that want to stay there are able to do that. Particular issues around rural communities and small towns and villages. And so that, I think, is very similar to the problem that I raise about people objecting to new homes no matter what.
Yeah.
I think if I were to make one change to the ballot policy, which I think is a really good one, so if you're a resident of a housing estate and a certain number of homes are to be lost, then you get to be asked, are you okay with what you're being offered in exchange? And that is offered, and that's legally binding, to kind of try and give those people who are giving up a lot, they're giving up their memories if the house is being demolished, the places where they raise their children, all those sorts of things, in exchange for this new home and more where you are. So I think that is a good thing. What I would do, though, is that I would also, every time that there is a ballot, again, back to those people on a housing waiting list, do you agree that we should have this ballot? Do you agree that we should build new homes? I think it should be standard that if homeless households should be consulted because they are an interested party. What you get instead is people that are well housed, permanently housed very often, and they are by and large well intentioned, but the things that are objections are not about the additionality of the new homes. It's about the impact on their living space. And I think those are about their environment. And I think those issues can and should be addressed, but it becomes really adversarial if it's done through the planning system. So somebody is worried that there's a park, the park is going to be lost because new homes are going to be put on it, or they are worried that more people will use the park. We need to decide as a city and as communities what is more important. And I go back to the woman living in a one-room apartment or a studio, or even a B&B somewhere, who is waiting for a house, but she has to wait 12 years. I mean, she would say yes. So I think we just need to be a little bit more robust about who it is that we ask. And if we ask people what they think about new development and new homes, we should ask everybody.
Yeah, that's right, because the people who if I understand you correctly, we are asking at the moment, have a vested interest in almost saying no sometimes to those new builds, whereas there's other wider stakeholders that perhaps need to be consulted.
So quite often those interventions from those people are helpful. So if something is if an architect proposes something which just doesn't work in an area, then it's right that somebody should say, but look at the surroundings, it's not necessarily just aesthetically not pleasing, but it just doesn't work. There's a process through which that can be fixed. But that should be the end of it, if that makes sense. It shouldn't be that if somebody doesn't like, I don't know, within the planning process, there are, people look at like the proximity to other homes. Yes, there will be more people, and yes, there will be a call on local services. And those things are rightly the responsibility of the local authority to provide, but I just don't think it's tenable that you can hold both views at the same time. I don't think what's the phrase I'm looking for? There's a cognitive dissonance in the way that we do planning on the ground. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and if you think about the economy as a whole, it's holding back productivity, because that NIMBYism or the counter arguments in some of those discussions mean, well, everyone's going to almost a prisoner's dilemma in some respects of, well, what's the solution going to be? And sometimes the solutions exist outside of the planning process, if I'm understanding correctly.
And they can be far less adversarial. They can be a process where people's views are taken on board. But the bit where I am pleased so far, it has stayed that way, and I want it to remain that way, is that the voice that matters the most is the people that live in that particular area, on that estate. So if it's not your house that's being potentially demolished and replaced with another one on top, then you do have a voice. Your voice is here, and it's secondary. And in terms of who will fill the houses on top, it should be the people that are in temporary accommodation who are currently homeless. It can't be right that we have the many people that we have in one of the wealthier cities in the world who are homeless. They're homeless and they're not on the streets, they're working. They do jobs, I don't know, in places like this, in local government. They are teachers, they are teaching assistants, they're public sector workers, but they are in temporary accommodation, or they are a cleaner or a porter or something, a normal job that a normal person in this city does. That is unconscionable. And I just think that going forward, and as we look to a Labour manifesto, a national one, I would want to see that circle squared, because we need to decide on our direction. And I think I was very reassured by what I heard at the London conference. I think the direction of travel from Lisa and Andy and others is a really good one. But I think we could definitely, when the time comes, outline, lay out our stall, and I think the really important thing is that approach doesn't apply just here in London, but it applies to the rest of the country as well. But it can be localised, and it will take into account whether it's a northern town, whether it's a village, a seaside town, whether it's the metropolis here, or whether it's a big city in the north, or even in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, those communities that struggle in their own way. And I think we can definitely have something which doesn't have built into it that cognitive dissonance, but also doesn't put people off and make people feel like they're losing something. Because I think that is it's kind of the unexplorated bit of the planning process, which is why I have some sympathy for those people that do, because it feels like they're losing something, but it's an intangible thing that's being lost. You can't touch it because that space over there is not yours to start with. But going back to that sense of community, you're doing something to my community, I demand to have a say, absolutely. But we need to make the case better.
Yeah, and going back to something you said earlier, and I think we're kind of running out of time, so it might have to be another conversation.
Yeah.
But a city needs a healthy mix of different types of people. So whilst you made a comment about 5 young adult individuals rather than a family, a city needs young, independent, single people, as well as families,
exactly,
as well as elderly porters, and a whole diversity of people.
Yeah.
But yeah, that might have to be another conversation, because this has been really interesting.
And I just wanted to add one thing.
Yeah.
So just as an example, I've got it's a very large constituency. There are 11 or 12 fire stations in the constituency across the 3 boroughs.
Is that normal, or that feels?
So so we've got Islington will have its own, Hackney will have its own stations, and then Waltham Forest has got the most, but it's vast, and there's a lot more in Waltham Forest. So it is about right, I think.
Okay.
But the point I wanted to say was I went to visit Islington Fire Station and had a really great couple of hours meeting the firefighters there and the staff. And then I was leaving, just like out of interest, do people that work here, do they live here? It's like, not a single person, actually one person lives in London. They can't afford to live here. Not a single one. And it's just, that is something which we need to make sure that people that serve our city can afford to live here. And you know what, even if you don't serve the city, even if you're just here to live your best life and have a good time, you should be able to live here too. And that is something which needs to be front and centre of a future housing strategy.
I agree wholeheartedly, because there is also something about user design thinking and either experiences of services. I'm not saying a firefighter is going to be like, because I live here, I'm not connected to the people, I'm not going to save them.
No,
absolutely
that's the
not.
point, yeah.
But you extrapolate that kind of behaviour over a long period of time, and particularly maybe on the policy making side of it, you will have divergence of outcomes and effective policies, etc. Because the people are not from there, or not within that community. So that's I agree with that.
I mean, and that is a conversation for a separate podcast. But it just means that if you're trying to encourage Londoners to join our public services, over a period of time, people haven't been able to stay in London, or they've had to drive in because that's how they can afford to work in the public services. You are going to lose a lot of talent.
Yeah.
And for those people travelling in, the people that I met were very professional and very good, and really signed up to a lot of the changes that need to happen within the fire service. Unequivocally. But they also recognise that it's a problem if you want to, I don't know, speak to somebody, Rashida from Andover Estate or something. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? It's just, it makes it not authentic. It's not authentically London. And I think that just needs to be overcome.
You definitely lose out. And again, it might be sensationalist to say, but I think I see some of that future in some cities like San Francisco and in LA, where companies are now hiring their own public service outlets, like buses or police security, and that's an interesting future, to have those public services in the hands of private enterprises as opposed to
which no one voted
the local
for.
people. Another conversation. But Sem, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting. I feel like we only just scratched the surface of some of that, because there's a lot more geeky details to get into, but maybe another time.
Thank you very much, Ade.
Thank you.